This is January 20th, 2020, and with Venerable Panabasa Mahatera. Welcome back to the show, Venerable.
Yeah, hail Brian.
I want to ask you about St. John of the Cross. You mentioned him before. He was a Christian monastic in Spain in the 1500s. You seem quite fond of him, so I just want to ask you if you could tell us his story.
Yeah, well, he's one of my favorite Christians, possibly my favorite Christian. And I think it's possible he may even have been more spiritually advanced than the founder of his religion. So,
Holy smokes.
Yeah, well, he was, I mean, if it's possible for a Christian to be an Arya, I think there's a good chance that he was an Arya. And one of the best books on mysticism I've ever read is his Ascent of Mount Carmel, which is really just classic. A lot of people think they understand mysticism and really don't. And I would encourage anyone who wants to really understand mysticism that, yeah, it's a good book to read, even though it's, it's all in like Roman Catholic lingo, so he'll be talking about, the Spirit of God and all this kind of stuff. But he doesn't talk much about Jesus or the Virgin Mary in that one. So. He's just trying to get straight to the practice and, the experiences that a mystic would have, that kind of thing. So there's not a whole lot of talk about, the Trinity and that kind of thing. But it's really a good book.
So what was it about him that was, you feel a meditator? Like, did he have a really solid ongoing meditation practice and his tradition that he was with?
Yeah, he was a member of a contemplative order. And just his whole life story is just really interesting. Like he was, let's see, go back to his parents. His father was like an aristocrat, maybe like minor nobility, sort of like in England, you got knights and stuff like that. They're not dukes or really high nobility, but they're kind of, upper class, sort of the lower level upper class. And his family was like silk merchants. They were rich silk merchants. And so St. John of the Cross' father, long before St. John of the Cross was born, he would travel around and do business. And along the lines, he fell in love with this peasant girl who was like a weaver.
Oh my God.
He wound up eloping with this peasant girl.
Oh, and he had a wife and children already at that time?
What do you mean?
Well, was he already married at that time?
No, he wasn't married yet. Well, he runs off with this peasant girl. He marries this peasant girl without his parents' permission.
Okay.
And Spanish people in the 16th century, they were pretty harsh people. And so they just cut him off. They just disowned him because he married below his class. So
they're really a class society, you're saying?
Yeah, it's a very class-conscious society. And he married below his class, sort of like Prince Harry did. But back in those days, that was just over the line. And so they just disowned him. He is no longer a member of the family. And so all of a sudden, he's got to make a living as like this peasant weaver with his wife. And they have 3 sons. And St. John of the Cross was the middle son, if I remember correctly. Oh. But they had such a hard life back then. This was back before welfare or anything like that, that he died within a few years after the youngest son was born. And so
the father died?
Yeah, so you've got this widow with 3 sons.
Oh,
and
God.
They were just almost at the level of begging in the streets. They were so poor. And in fact, St. John of the Cross's younger brother died. I think it was his younger brother. And they think it was because of malnutrition. They were just starving. In fact, when St. John of the Cross was full grown, he was only about 4'10". He was stunted in his growth, probably because of malnutrition as a kid. And so his mother sent him to a school for poor boys that was run by the church, because almost all schools were run by the Catholic Church in 16th century Spain. And so even as a little kid, in order to earn his keep at this school, they had him working at a plague hospital where people are dying of bubonic plague. So even as a little kid, he's like having to like clean the sores of people dying of plague and seeing corpses and, cleaning up their puke and this kind of stuff. And I mean, that helped him to become a saint later on. I mean, when you're a kid and you're exposed to all this hardness, this hardship, It's either going to destroy you or it's going to make you stronger. And in his case, it made him stronger. So
Yep.
there's all that. But the thing is, he was really smart. And so he got scholarships, and he wound up going to one of the main Catholic universities. I think it was Salamanca or something like that. And he was such a bright student that all these different groups, like the Jesuits and these different monastic orders, they're all trying to recruit him. And he could have been a priest too, like a parish priest, and that way he could have supported his mother. But he was just really into asceticism and just strict, like, contemplative practice.
Oh, he said his mother's still alive.
Yeah, his mother and his elder brother they survived.
And they're poor.
Yeah, they were poor, but they were still alive. And he wound up joining the Carmelites, which was a contemplative sect, a contemplative order of Christianity. They were like a meditation order. So it was kind of similar to like Buddhism in the East, like Zen Buddhism. Zen is a corruption of jhana, which originally just meant meditation. So Zen is like literally the meditation school, and Christianity also had like contemplative orders that did a lot of meditation. And so he joined one of those. And then when he was a young monk, a young Carmelite, there was a Carmelite nun named Teresa of Avila who started a reform movement called the discalced Carmelites.
Oh, I actually mentioned in my book, like 20 years ago, my book, Freeing the Buddha, I have a chapter on Christian meditation. So she was probably a jhana master, right? A really great, saintly woman.
Yeah, according to St. John of the Cross, she had mastered contemplation, which would mean that she would be like a master of fourth jhana.
Wow. So
Yeah.
he thought of her as like a perfected woman, a perfected one or something?
Yeah, we can get to that, like the philosophy, okay. His description of spiritual attainment and all that.
Sure.
But she had started a reform movement. Like she figured that the Carmelites had sort of gotten soft and corrupt, and she was trying to found a reform movement where they would get stricter again. And St. John of the Cross joined the movement. So he was one of the first monks to join the discalced Carmelite movement. And discalced literally means shoeless, because they wore like sandals instead of regular shoes. That was just one of the ways that they were stricter, So he became like father confessor to these contemplative monks and nuns. He was a father confessor at a convent a lot of the time.
So you think in that role, he's kind of like a meditation instructor.
Yeah. I mean, his interviews were largely like what would be called meditation interviews. So he had a lot of experience in teaching contemplation, and also he learned a lot of the experiences of these meditators because they're confessing to him, and asking him for guidance and all this.
Oh, so he would say, do this technique or do that.
Yeah. And
wow.
He got in lots of trouble, and pretty much anybody who accomplishes anything really important is going to be controversial, and they're going to face lots of resentment. And the fact that he was
thank you, Venerable Barnabas. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, the fact that he's trying to reform this movement means that the majority who aren't reformed are going to be fighting against him.
Yeah, because they make them look bad, you mean?
Yeah. It's like they're not good enough, they're crooked and corrupt and all this. And so, of course, they're doing everything they can. They're getting the Inquisition on St. John of the Cross's case. And the Inquisition was going full blast in those days.
I guess it was, 1500s.
Yeah.
The late 1500s, like 1590s or something?
Yeah, it was the late 1500s.
Yeah.
Mostly. And so, he's getting the Inquisition on his case and just getting into trouble. And the discalced, or the Carmelites, are passing these laws saying that discalced Carmelite convents cannot be opened in these areas. And he went ahead and did it because of his vow of obedience to his senior. But still, they caught him for it, and they threw him in prison, and he was getting, he's living on bread and water and being, regularly flogged and all this kind of stuff. And eventually he escaped and got away. But
they threw him in prison for being a monk teaching meditation?
Well, I mean, it was politics.
Yeah, politics.
Mainly they hated him because he was a leader in the reform movement. And, you know,
So
they're
how long
trying,
was he in prison for?
I don't remember. But
Yeah.
it was getting to the point where he knew he was either going to have to escape or he was just going to starve to death because, you know, they were treating him really badly.
Do you know how he managed to escape?
It was like an old monastery building, and they had him locked into this tiny little room. And he noticed that the lock was so old that if you just keep like chipping away at it, that eventually he could break out. And so then he did that, and then he climbed out the window and had to climb over a wall and this kind of thing. And then his friends kept him hidden until they just stopped looking for him.
Great. Wow.
Yeah.
Carry on. What a story.
Yeah, and they were persecuting him a second time, and he was planning on going to Mexico to become like a missionary, just to get away from all the politics and everything. And then he wound up dying of some kind of weird, I think it's called erysipelas, something like that. I'm not exactly sure. It's like a staph infection of the skin or something. He died of a disease, and so that was it. I think he was like in his 40s or 50s at that time.
That young, eh? 40s to 50s.
Well, back in those days.
That's common, I know, yeah.
Yeah, back in those days, they didn't have antibiotics or anything like that. So you get a disease and, you know, it's.
Yeah.
So anyway, I read pretty much everything he's written. I used to have a book that was the collected works of St. John of the Cross. And so everything that he wrote, including his letters, was included, although most of the letters that he wrote were destroyed because people who were afraid of the Inquisition, if they had letters from him, they just burned them, because if they were found in possession of this, and he's being accused of being like a heretic and everything.
Oh.
So, but
they would be burned at the stake if they had a letter, or they'd be flogged.
You could get into trouble for it. You know, it's sort of like if you've got a book on demonology or something. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of the ancient books that were written by pagans in like ancient Rome, they no longer exist because, you know, Christian book burnings, and people are afraid of being caught with this book because it's considered to be, you know, heretical or whatever. So
what was his heyday? I guess was before he went to prison. Then, right? All of his accomplishments.
No, after he escaped, I think he was still like a father confessor. He was still writing books and that kind of thing. He wrote like.
Could he go back to a monastery after he escaped? Could he hide out?
Yeah, they eventually just kind of gave up and just accepted that he was free. But then they started a new case against him later on.
Oh, so when he was free, you're saying he went back to a monastery being a father confessor again?
Yeah.
Oh, so they just accepted it. Okay.
Yeah. And
the politics going back and forth, I can imagine.
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth. You know, it depended a lot on who was the leader of the Carmelites and who was like the Pope's nuncio, I think he's called, like the Pope's representative in Spain. You know, if he was on the side of the unreformed Carmelites or the reformed Carmelites. So there's a lot of back and forth politically.
Oh, and that position can change. Different people can change.
Yeah. It just depends. You know, the old guy is he resigns or dies or retires or whatever, and then gets replaced by a new guy who favors the other side. You know,
like ministers in Trump's government, that kind of thing.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. And really, a lot of people who read St. John of the Cross, especially Christians, they just think he's horrible. You know, get him away from me. You know, he's called the terrible little ascetic because, you know, he was less than 5 feet tall. He was really small. And he is so radical in just the asceticism part. You know, it was sort of this macho toughness of, you know, not necessarily punishing yourself, but, you know, you just make do with, you know, make do with the bare necessities of life.
Well, that's why you like him. So because you're so macho and tough yourself, living in caves for 20 years in Burma.
That's one reason, but the main reason I like him is just that he was obviously a master of jhana. I mean, he really was speaking from the point of view of experience.
Wow,
you can read his
tremendous
stuff,
respect for that.
and even though he interprets stuff along Christian lines, because he really didn't have any choice. I mean, that was pretty much the only religion he had access to.
Yeah.
So if he's going to be spiritual, he's going to have to do it along Christian lines.
Even if he believed other things, he'd still have to do it politically on Christian lines.
Yeah, but he really didn't have much opportunity to be exposed even.
Yeah.
He might never even heard of Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, that time, very little
Although,
Buddhist knowledge of Buddhism.
although he would have made a great Buddhist. You know, if he was a Buddhist, he'd be a famous Buddhist saint probably at this time. And so he talks about, and I told you before, like his instructions on how to contemplate is you just dismiss everything from your mind that isn't God. You know, so it's like you can't imagine God with your imagination. So you get rid of your imagination, you just let it go, dismiss it. You know, you can't figure out God rationally. So, you know, the logical stuff is gone. You can't see God, you can't hear God. So all the sensory stuff is gone. And so essentially you just dismiss all mental states until your mind is just clear like glass and silent. And that's what he called contemplation. But when you do that, you realize that your mind isn't completely empty. You're not just this blank unconsciousness. There's still this something there, and that's the spirit of God that fills the whole universe.
Wow. Great stuff, eh?
Yeah, and he called that dark faith. You know,
Wow.
It's not a faith where you're actually believing something. It's this faith where you just get rid of everything, but still deep down there's this divinity, this infinity that's still there, you know. And he called that dark faith. And yeah, it's just hard not, I mean, if you're really into sort of radical mystical spirituality, it's hard not to like this guy.
Yeah, I'm into that too.
And he even had a system of spiritual development that's similar to Buddhism. Not the 4 stages of sainthood, you know, like the stream enterer and the once returner and the never returner and the arahant. But his system was like, you've got the beginner, the adept, and the perfect, which would correspond to the Theravada Buddhist of the Putujana, which is the common person, the Seikha, the person who is in training, and that would be like the lower 3 stages of sainthood. And then you've got the Aseka, the one who is no longer in training, and that's a fully enlightened being. That's an arahant.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's kind of the same system that he had, where almost everybody is a beginner. You know, more than 99.9% of the Earth's population are beginners. But once you have mastered jhana, or once you've mastered contemplation, where you can just sit down and just stop thinking for as long as you want, where you can just stop your thought process. And he says it doesn't completely stop. You know, every once in a while, just from the Buddhist point of view, it would just be the power of karma causes thoughts to spontaneously arise. But your mindfulness and your concentration are so good, you can just let them go as soon as they arise.
So does he actually talk in those terms of stopping thoughts?
Yeah.
Good.
Pretty much.
Impressive.
I don't remember his exact words, but it was along those lines.
Wow.
And so it was essentially the same kind of spiritual progression as also is taught in Buddhism. And also his idea of the stage of perfection, which surprised me, because like in Christianity, it's like everyone's a sinner, nobody's worthy kind of a thing. You know, nobody is perfect. That's, you know, kind of what the New Testament of the Bible teaches, that it's only through the, you know, forgiveness and mercy of God that anyone gets into heaven, because nobody
is original sin.
Yeah, everybody is imperfect.
And there's nothing to do about it unless you're saved by Jesus, basically.
Yeah, so I was surprised that St. John of the Cross actually talks about the stage of perfection that you can attain in this life. And the way he describes it is you mortify your own self-will. So anything that you like, and Ajahn Chah used to talk about this kind of stuff too, anything that you like, you should avoid it. So that you're cutting off all of your own preferences. And so eventually your own preferences just kind of wither up and die, and you're no longer acting on your own volition, your own self-will. So you become a kind of puppet of God, where you're kind of empty. Yeah. And then God has got like his hand inside of you like a hand puppet, and he's working you, and you're working in accordance with the will of God rather than your own human, you know, imperfect will. And in a way, that's similar to what Buddhism teaches. Like an arahant makes no new karma, and karma is volition. So an arahant also has no self-will. It's just that, you know, in Buddhism, you wouldn't say that the arahant is acting in accordance with the will of God, because Buddhism really doesn't talk about the will of God.
Well, we don't have a God, yeah.
Yeah, so in Buddhism, it has a little bit of difficulty explaining how arahants do anything if they don't have volitions, you know. But
aren't they acting out of compassion for others to help them?
well, it wouldn't be ordinary volition. It has to be some special kind. Like in Abhidhamma, they've got the functional chitta or something like that. That it's like some special kind of volition that an arahant has that allows him to do things, to make decisions.
Really? I'm thinking the law of cause and effect maybe working through the arahant is no law.
Yeah. It's just you think that the arahant would just spontaneously do the right thing all the time. That's kind of what Buddhism teaches. Whereas in Christianity, it's the spirit of God, the will of God determining your actions rather than your own fallible human self-will that's determining it. So that was interesting too, just his whole concept of sort of Christian enlightenment through contemplation, which is really similar to what is taught in Buddhism. And even the practices are the same. Like for mindfulness in Christianity, or at least for the Catholics, it's called recollection, which is the same as sati in Pali, which it can mean memory, but it can also mean just being in the present moment, where you're not thinking about the past at all. The past is just gone. You just completely let go of it. And so you're always constantly in the present moment. And, it's called recollection, and it's pretty much the same as Buddhist mindfulness. And then, of course, the concentration stuff is what they call contemplation.
So by recollection, meaning he's just recollecting the present moment. You're not recollecting the past.
Yeah, well, that's a weird thing that I've never really understood.
Why would they call it recollection?
In Buddhism, the Pali word sati, it means mindfulness, but it also can mean memory. Like in Burmese, thadiyate means I remember. I have sati of that. I remember that from the past.
That means remembering to come back to this moment now. When your mind wanders off, remembering this moment now.
Yeah, I suppose. But it's kind of interesting that Christianity had that same weird choice of words for essentially the same phenomenon, where being in the present moment and just remembering the past have the same word of either sati in Pali or recollection. I don't know what the original Spanish that he used would be, because he wrote and spoke in Spanish. But that was interesting to me, and it's good to compare different religions, or what different religions say about the same kind of thing, because you're looking at the same thing from different points of view, which can help you to understand it. If you just study one spiritual system, then you're kind of locked into one way of looking at things. Whereas if Roman Catholicism and Buddhism are talking about the same kind of practices and the same kind of results of those practices, then you can it can help you at least to just weed out the cultural stuff and just get straight to the heart of it.
Yeah, so it can help a Buddhist studying that Catholic perspective. You've corrected me in some mistakes I made between Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada. I was a bit too hard on Mahayana. You give me more perspective. So I see what you mean by looking at another perspective on the same experience.
Yeah, so I like St. John of the Cross because of that too. Plus, he was just this tough little ascetic guy. He really was more interested in telling the truth than in staying out of trouble, which is something I have respect for.
Like the bad boys of Buddhism, you and I are the same way.
Yeah, sometimes.
We're happy to get into trouble, some trouble, a bit of trouble.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, I think he might be, assuming that Jesus existed, he might have been more highly advanced than Jesus. Whether Jesus, assuming that he existed, was an arahant or not is hard to say. But I think it's possible that St. John of the Cross may have been, even though technically speaking he had, wrong view, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But to some degree, you really don't have any choice, especially if you're raised in, post Renaissance Spain, like 16th century Spain. It's just not an option for you to really believe anything other than Catholicism. And so you're going to have to find a route to ultimate reality using that as a kind of vehicle.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. You're in that culture. You don't want to get burned at the stake, so you have to work within that.
Yeah,
So
well,
you
you're not
got
even
this a lot.
exposed to an alternative.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I've had interactions with atheists in the past. They're talking about how stupid people were in the past, like in the Middle Ages, everyone believed in God, and I wouldn't have believed in God. And I'm saying, you know, it just wasn't really an option. I mean, most people wouldn't even consider the possibility of not believing in God. You know, it wasn't even on the table as an option, you know.
I agree. Even when my parents were married in 1951, they're Catholics in Holland. My father said, well, you just get married and have kids. You don't even think about it. Of course you're going to have kids. And of course they believed in God. You know, even then they didn't even think about it. Of course they believed that, you know.
Yeah, it's just
Later left the Catholic Church in 1965. He, you know, had his differences in the faith, but that time it's just like you say.
yeah. Plus, Catholicism is close to Buddhism in another way, in that a lot of Catholics consider the Buddha to be a Catholic saint. So there's that too. I think we may have talked about that before. I'm pretty sure we mentioned that in a previous video.
I don't remember saying that Catholics consider the Buddhist to be like a Catholic saint.
Yeah, he's Saint Josephat.
Oh
Buddha,
yeah, I remember
Saint
hearing about
Joseph.
that about 20 years ago. Josephat
Yeah.
was the Bodhisattva.
Yeah. Although technically speaking, it wasn't really the Buddha. It was the Buddha in a past life.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not the same as the Buddha being a Catholic saint. It's just some previous life of his mentioned in the Jataka stories got
Yeah.
translated into Latin. You know, it moved into like medieval Europe and was translated into Latin. And he was such a wise and good person. Everyone just naturally assumed that he had to be a good Christian. And so he got canonized as a saint.
Oh yeah, I remember that. And then the Catholic Church was embarrassed, and they found out later, oh, this was about Buddhism, so they couldn't unsanctify him. They just stopped observing. It was like a big day, like a big holiday or feast day, and they stopped observing it.
I think you can unsanctify. I think like Saint Christopher isn't really a saint anymore.
But I think Josephat, they didn't change his status, did they?
No, I think he's still a saint. I think
Yeah.
still got his own feast day, and there's
Oh.
at least two churches that are dedicated to Saint Josephat. I think one's in southern France and the other one's like in Sicily or something. And I was talking to a Roman Catholic priest in Burma who said that there's a monastery in Germany where they've got a shrine to each one of the Catholic saints. And for Saint Josephat, they've just got a Buddha statue sitting there.
Wow, a Buddha statue.
Yeah, so I can be like a discalced member of the Order of Saint Josephat.
You could be a member of the order then.
Yeah, I'm a member of
the Catholic Church.
The Contemplative Order of Saint Josephat, discalced.
So if you want to move from your monastery now somewhere else, you can always consider the Catholic Church.
Yeah, well, I know kind of a lot about the Catholic Church. I mean, even setting aside the possibility that I was like a Christian in past lives, you know, if anyone who's familiar with Western history, you know, for centuries and centuries, you know, Roman Catholicism was the religion of the West.
Yeah.
You know, so you have to pick up a lot of that, and so I understand it pretty well, and it's just soaked into Western culture, you know. So you just pick up, you know, a lot of people are more Christian than they realize. They might be atheists or just secular materialists their entire life, but still they're carrying around this subconscious Christian baggage, like archetypes and stuff.
Oh yes.
So it's helpful to understand it, even if you're not a Christian. I mean, everyone in the West should read the Bible at least once, just so that they'll know what it is they're not accepting, you know. And it's the most important single book in Western civilization.
Of course it is.
Kind of unfortunately, because it's, you know, it's all Jewish stuff, but still it's, you know, it's so important for the culture. And so yeah, familiarity with Christianity is a good idea, even if you're not a Christian. And I've
been reading the Old Testament, you know, kind of the violence of it was good to understand that. Yeah, this is the mold of our culture. Yeah, absolutely, it's important. Sure, that's a good point. It's good to study it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think even something like reading the Quran. You know, I've read the Quran before. I mean, it's a good idea at least to know what it is you're rejecting. You know, or if you're going to argue against it, at least you'll know what you're arguing against. Because, you know, every once in a while I'll come across some Christian person who's arguing against Buddhism, and they don't even know what they're talking about.
Oh, I know, I get that, yeah.
You know, it's like I had this one person saying, you know, the Buddhists, you know, they contort their body into these unnatural shapes to please demons, and when they meditate, they're just reciting the names of devils and this kind of stuff. And it's like, where do you get this stuff? You know,
It's something that their pastor told them to try to keep them away from the competition.
yeah, it must
I
be.
would assume that.
So it's good to read the stuff that you disagree with or that you don't follow, just if only to know what you're rejecting, and also to give you some ability to explain why it's wrong if you're in a position to explain, you know, why you're this way instead of that way. You know, it just makes sense.
Yeah. I want to ask about St. John of the Cross. Tell more about his teacher, St. Teresa of Avila. Like, what was their relationship? Like, did she really get him started in deep meditation? Did she really deserve credit for developing his whole spiritual life? What was their relationship like?
Well, I'm sure she wasn't his only teacher, but she was one of his senior spiritual advisors. And he was her father confessor for a while. So they had a lot of really, you know, deep down conversations about, you know, religion and that kind of thing. Although with regard to Saint Teresa,
you mean she was his father confessor?
Well, no, a nun couldn't be a monk's father confessor or a confessor at all.
Oh.
You always had to have a male priest to be a father confessor.
But was he her father confessor?
Yeah, for a while.
Oh, and also she was more, you say the founder of the order, Carmelite order, so she was more senior to him then, right?
Yeah, she was senior to him. Yeah.
Well, because of the political relationship, of course, she can't be a father confessor.
Yeah, I think only a male could be a father confessor. Because only a male could be like an ordained priest in the Catholic Church. I think it's still that way, even though the lefties are fighting to get female priests and married priests and gay priests and all this.
So that time she was a nun, though, right?
Yeah, she was a nun. So she was like his teacher, even though technically, you know, he had to be the father confessor, and so he was the father confessor to the entire convent, including her.
Oh, okay.
For a while.
So she was around for how long, and then he came along? What was this?
I don't know exactly. I don't remember that much.
How did she develop?
I lent my collected works. I lent my collected works to somebody, and I never got it back.
Oh.
But, yeah. With regard to Mother or Teresa of Avila, I don't like her nearly as much. Partly because Saint John, when he's talking about contemplation, especially, I mean, it's very philosophical and technical. You know, he's really, really intelligent, kind of a cerebral approach, which is, you know, right up my alley. I'm more operate that way. You know, I'm more scientific than artistic, or more philosophical than religious. You know, the Buddhists, you know, are often that way. Western Buddhists, especially, where you're just more philosophical than religious. And St. John of the Cross's approach is more like that. Whereas St. Teresa, I read her autobiography too, and I don't know, she struck me as being a little bit nutty. I mean, both of them had, you know, visions and heard voices and stuff sometimes, but St. Teresa, she had so many visions that she was starting to get in trouble because, you know, this was when she was a young nun before St. John of the Cross came along. You know, her father confessor was a little worried that, you know, are these real visions or not? And so he gave her the instruction that whenever she saw a vision, she should make the sign of the cross, you know, just in case it's like a demon or something, because of course the Inquisition is starting to get interested, and they're kind of looking into this too. And when the Inquisition starts paying attention, you start getting worried. And the thing was, she was seeing so many visions that it was just taking up so much time, her making the sign of the cross, that she just had to start carrying a little crucifix around with her so she could just hold it up every time she saw a vision. So, yeah, as a non-Christian, then I'm inclined to think that the visions she was having were like hysterical dissociation or whatever, you know, that we've talked about this before also, where, you know, like medieval saints or like the really strict Christian saints, they were so saintly that they were probably just hysterical as hell. Where, you know, they've got so much repressed, you know, human natural urges that they were like basket cases in certain respects. But it helped them to be saints, but still, when you're hearing voices all the time and seeing visions and stuff all the time, she's seeing like the flames of hell and all this kind of stuff all the time. That, yeah, from a non-Christian point of view, you'd have to suspect it to be a little bit on the psychological side, So Saint Teresa, she wrote a lot of instructions on meditation and stuff too, but I really wasn't as much interested in her approach as St. John's approach.
But you think she probably reached jhana, though, right?
St. John of the Cross certainly thought so. He thought she had reached the stage of perfection.
Well, that's quite impressive.
She mastered jhana, or contemplation as it's called for the Christians. So
you think she was having these visions some more beforehand, and later when she's reaching jhana, that calmed down a bit? Do you think she reached jhana?
There's a good chance of it. If St. John of the Cross thought so, and he was like her, meditation interviewer, then probably he would know a lot better than I would. And when you're contemplating, then the visions, you probably have a heck of a lot fewer of them. And like St. John of the Cross would advise, the nuns or the monks, if they come to him saying they had visions, he'd say that if you're contemplating, you have a vision, just dismiss it, just let it go. If it isn't God, let it go. And any of these visions and stuff, they're just visions, just let it go. And if it really is a divine one, it's going to have its effect on you anyway. So
do you think she followed that instruction?
I guess so. I don't know. I can't really say.
Wow. So the two of them were quite impressive, jhana leaders. So you're quite impressive, both of them, I guess.
Yeah, well, St. John of the Cross is the mystical doctor. Everything he wrote is now considered to be authoritative on the topic of mysticism for the Catholic Church.
Really? Really? So is he like the highest authority in the Catholic Church now?
With regard to mysticism, he is authoritative. Anything that he says on the subject of mysticism is authoritative dogma for the Catholic Church now.
Wow. So was it after his death that they elevated his status?
Yeah, it had to be. Because he was in trouble with the Inquisition and in trouble with the church authorities and possibly even with the Pope. So
when did they change their mind? He probably died in the 1600s, right? Around that time?
Yeah. I don't remember exactly. I don't think it took very long. But some saints, they're not even canonized as saints until hundreds of years later, like Joan of Arc. She wasn't even canonized as a saint until the early 20th century. It was like 1905 or something like that.
Yeah, I see. So, did he have a lineage, St. John of the Cross? Like, did his monks, attain jhana? Did they carry on the Carmelite order? How did it go after he died?
It's still a contemplative order, but I'm not sure. I really don't know if there have been any really great discalced Carmelites after St. John of the Cross. I assume there have been, but none as famous as him. So
you kind of think of it as this brief shining moment in history in the late 1500s. It reaches very deep jhana meditation in Catholic Church. Brief period.
Yeah, that was like mysticism was really starting to hit traction in the West. It was like the Counter-Reformation. It was called in Spain at that time. It was like Martin Luther had already started Protestantism in the North. And so in the South, the Catholic Church was getting stricter in order to compete against Protestantism. And that was when people like St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, also St. Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, that happened at about the same time. So
that reminds me of your video last week on social Darwinism and the competition of ideas, because the Protestants arose in the 1500s. So there's a backlash where the Catholics are getting a bit more serious in their spiritual practice.
Yeah. So again, it's like competition leads to strength and efficiency.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got just a one-party system or just only one religion or something like that, then things tend to get corrupt and sloppy and go downhill.
So that's a good example. St. John of the Cross. So they accepted him after the fact because they needed a good Catholic saint to compete with the Protestants. Probably they probably realized they needed him.
Yeah, maybe. But then right after that, because of Protestantism, and they were against monks and nuns. That was one of the first things the Protestants did, was to abolish monasticism. And so mysticism pretty much just, that ended mysticism in the West. Mysticism has been a major factor in just about any kind of spiritual tradition except in Western Europe.
Well, you're saying the Protestants threw out mysticism. That's an important point. But the Catholics didn't, do they?
They didn't throw it out, but it just got sidelined. It got marginalized after that.
Oh.
And then because, especially when you had the Renaissance, and then humanism, and then science, and then materialism pretty much just took over. So right about the time that mysticism was really starting to strike traction in the West, then this whole new movement of humanism and like empiricism and materialism just kind of took over, and that was the end of it.
Yeah,
it's still there, but it's not really significant.
Like from the 59s, around 1780, I think, was like the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And you can think of scientism as a religion, as a religious belief, the belief in science, scientism. So yeah, that period in there, about 2 centuries. So after, I guess you're saying after the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the mysticism of the West would die off. Like even here in Canada, United States, in the West, prior to 1780, people would be, good at talking to spirits or working with shrines. People in the neighborhood had this kind of talent. It was something more respected. And then with the rise of Industrial Revolution, that kind of faded away.
Yeah, well, it was even before the Industrial Revolution. You had the Enlightenment, so-called, which it was, it's like the founders of the Enlightenment, which started like in the late 1600s, like John Locke, where, they're saying that superstition should be replaced by philosophy. And by superstition, they mainly meant Christianity, and by philosophy, they mainly meant scientific empiricism.
Oh, I see problems with that. Wow. Late 1600s with John Locke.
Yeah. And then, of course, like, especially in America, I assume in Europe also, like in the late 1800s, there was another resurgence of spirituality, which was partly just sort of a reaction against Darwin and just the fact that science was really starting to take over then. It was getting to the point where science was able to explain just about everything important, except maybe why the universe exists in the first place.
I know there around the late 1800s, like spiritualism was growing almost like stronger than Christianity in the States. Like the idea of speaking to the dead, getting mediums to talk to the dead, talking to ghosts, spiritualism, that was really big in the United States.
Yeah. Also like Christian Science with Mary Baker Eddy with faith healing and that kind of stuff also.
So that's a reaction against scientism, I guess.
Yeah. So I think Darwin had a lot to do with it, because he was really delivered this devastating blow to Christianity, especially creationism, where finally science had some kind of theory that they could challenge it with.
Yeah.
So that caused like another reaction of spirituality kind of fighting against it, but it didn't really last.
So it's like what you're saying about the competition of ideas, right? You can see reactions cause, reactions and reactions going on here.
Yeah. Similarly, like nowadays, it's like there's like an upsurge of like the far right, so-called like white nationalism or whatever, and that is largely a reaction against the radical left that is rising up.
That's attacking the straight white male. Yeah, we're defending ourselves. Yeah.
So it's still survival of the fittest. Darwin was right, with at least to that extent.
Yeah, this is very good. Anything else on John of the Cross? For I guess it's about almost 45 minutes here.
Wow, that went fast.
Yeah, it did. I appreciate it because you've touched on him before, and I want to do a whole video just on him. I've learned a lot in this talk. I appreciate. I'm really interested in history, because there's huge gaps in my understanding of history. So, like I just did one on causes of World War I a few days ago with Apollonian. I appreciate that. So I appreciate your knowledge of history here.
Yeah, St. John of the Cross. He's one of my Western non-Buddhist culture heroes. I've got a few. He's one of them.
Okay.
And he's got some famous sayings that are really good, like so that you may know all things, seek to know nothing. So that you may possess all things, seek to possess nothing. And that was sort of his radical approach. It's like you eliminate all knowledge from your mind, and all that remains is like the omniscience of God, and you become God through participation by becoming like God's puppet. So that was interesting. There's this famous drawing that St. John of the Cross made, the Ascent of Mount Carmel. That's the name of his most famous book, I think. And the top of Mount Carmel is perfection, and the road to the top of Mount Carmel is just nada, 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 which is like nothing, 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 all the way up to the top, which is like radical mysticism, more mystical than most mystics are. Because most mystics, they've got a little bit of stuff mixed in, It's not pure mysticism. There's always a little bit of thinking and stuff going on, but he was just going for the absolute pure, crystal clear, dark faith. And also he drew pictures. He's got a famous picture of Jesus on the cross that he saw in a vision. So he wrote it down. And then Salvador Dali tried he did his own version of Jesus on the cross based on St. John of the Cross. And also St. John of the Cross is the patron saint of Spanish poets, because he wrote a lot of poetry too.
Wow. But what image does he use for nada, 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 going up the mountain with nothing, nothing? What does that look like visually?
It's just kind of a mountain that's got, just the word nothing, nothing, nothing going all the way up to the top of it.
Oh, really? So he drew that himself, you mean?
Yeah, although I think the version they have now wasn't originally drawn by him. It was just copied by another monk who liked it. And so he made a copy of it for himself, and then the original version somehow got lost or destroyed or whatever.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. But that kind of radical mysticism I like. Something, yeah. And then like the opposite, like just about every religious system has some kind of mystical tradition. Like even in Islam, you've got the Sufis.
Yeah.
And then like in the Jews have got Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is just so filled with this junk, in my opinion, this gobbledygook of the tree of Sephiroth and all these weird names and everything.
Well, I think they stole the Kabbalah from some earlier system. It's not.
Yeah, well, it could be influenced by it, but still, I mean, it's so full of all this gobbledygook stuff that it's not really mysticism, in my opinion. There's a little bit of mysticism mixed in, but you want the real deal. I mean, you just got to get rid of all these weird names and all that, and just go straight into the nada.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's like the Buddhist approach also.
Let it go.
Yeah, you're not supposed to be thinking about all this stuff. You're not supposed to be interpreting it while it's happening. You might try to interpret it later on after it's done, but while it's happening, you just wide open. Your mind is just like a mirror or like glass or something, and you're not trying to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah. Any other quotes from John of the Cross you want to talk about?
Oh, not that I can think of offhand, but there's lots of good ones. I haven't read the book in a long time because I don't have the book anymore, but it's.
Do you recommend any website links? Like people could just Google St. John of the Cross, right? Or any book, the name of the book?
Yeah, the Ascent of Mount Carmel. Okay. And then some of his poetry also, if people like poetry. I mean, it would be translated into English, so it probably wouldn't rhyme anymore, but still. He's got some really good poetry. Like there's one where he's trying to describe like a mystical experience. High contemplation, it was called. Yeah, which is really good.
Wow. Yeah, I guess people could just Google them, right? And get a lot of this.
Yeah, I'm sure they could.
Wow. Very good. I think I'll take a look then at St. John of the Cross. Really appreciate this talk, Venerable Panabasa.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, I'm Brian Rue. Please subscribe to the Brian Rue channel on YouTube.